I guess I need to say at least a couple of words about Marx from last time. Famous German philosopher Leo Strauss said that, very famously held that political philosophy is, in essence, an esoteric discipline. It cannot and should not be taught to everyone because most people are unable to understand the deep truths of politics. They will hear the words of philosophers and misunderstand what's spoken. It's a good question. Is this a proper approach or not? And among the courses I teach, in which courses can I say certain things? Maybe should I say certain things and should I not say certain things? It's an interesting question for me in my head. Don't want to be dramatic, but yeah, last class came very close to showing to me that maybe I should actually stop calling myself Marxist because people don't understand what I mean by that. I don't know. Well, mostly I am talking to myself next year, so I suppose I can continue doing that. Whatever. It's a complicated question. I'll have to think about in my spare time. Anyway, let me clear up, if not for you, then at least for me next year, certain things which I'm sure I've said, but certainly too fast last time and without paying appropriate attention to them. So first of all, I think that we have to understand, this is going to be 5 minutes, I'm going to say this very quickly. First of all, I think we need to understand Marx in the context of the Project of Enlightenment. And I gave you the formulation of the Project of Enlightenment by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. A couple of classes ago when we talked about Hegel, this notion that human life can be organized in a rational fashion through what Rousseau calls the general will. And I think this is in a very deep and important sense, this is the basis of Marx's approach to communism. If you think that in principle communism is impossible, then you disagree with the whole Project of Enlightenment. It's a very tall order. Most people are willing to say that communism is a utopia without understanding the implications of what they're saying. I think this has to be taken to heart. Secondly, even if we consider that in communism there are certain insoluble problems in terms of the distribution of power in society, and that in communism still people will be alienated, will have to be alienated, will have to engage in alienated labor. I'm not a fan of this phrase in Marx, alienation. I haven't mentioned it a single time in the last lecture for a reason. But anyway, let's use this phrase. Even if we are talking about alienation, we are talking about less of alienation. Again, Marx talks about this realm of necessity and realm of freedom and says that communism is the shortening of the length of the working day. Okay, so the working day is shortened, and to the extent that you still have the working day, you are alienated. But that's the whole point, that you make it shorter, you shorten it. So there's the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom. Okay, the realm of necessity maybe is subject to alienation, although I think if you read Rousseau carefully, and if you agree with Rousseau, it's not a realm of alienation. But even if it is, still we're talking about a difference, a very important difference in degree. So less alienation. But even if that's impossible, very important point to keep in mind is that whatever Marx is saying, whatever solutions he proposes, people, 100 or 200 years ago had it much, much worse. That's the whole point. That, Marx does have problems, and I'll talk about some of them today. Weber is very important for pointing that out. But, if you think, I don't want to restart this whole conversation we had last time, but if you think, qualified neurosurgeons are impossible to obtain under communism. Well, 200 years you had no qualified neurosurgeons, and society worked. Again, Marx is a philosopher of freedom, and I think it's an important link between Marx and Rousseau, Republican freedom. And if we don't understand that, we're not getting anywhere. But let me draw the line here. Even if communism is completely impossible, that's fine. That's fine. Because who cares? Communism is an ideal type. It is a certain model that is supposed to explain something about reality. And what does it explain about? So, and I said this last time. I said this on many occasions that I think that a careful reading of Marx, if you were University of London students, you would have to be able to argue for that. This isn't my opinion. This is requirement of the University of London exam. What is the requirement of the University of London exam? For you to understand that Marx does, on a careful reading, does not say that communism is inevitable. Marx does not say that communism is inevitable on careful reading of Marx. And on very careful reading of Marx, it's not even clear if communism is good. Because words, good or bad, are products of superstructural morality, and deeply within the base, within the, not Marx as a prophet, but Marx as a careful analyst, is not allowed to use words such as good or bad. But so we are talking about an ideal type. And this ideal type is useful because you can criticize existing societies by looking at this ideal type, by comparing it, so in terms of critique. But also, it can help us analyze pockets of what, properly speaking, I think should be called communism under capitalism. Things like Wikipedia, which I talked about last time. So even if communism is unattainable, you can rank all the various regimes along this scale. Okay. Let me grant you. I mean, I'm not sure, but for the sake of the argument, at qualification number 4, let me grant you, for the sake of the argument, that communism is impossible. Still, there's a difference between Denmark and Russia and Sierra Leone. And this is a real difference. And again, in terms of an ideal type, Marx is capturing something important. So I suppose I should stop talking about Marx now, because we have a very important, maybe even a more important topic today. But I want you to keep in mind this again. Communism is a normative ideal, not necessarily realizable. Exactly the same way when Rousseau is talking about the true social contract, he does not mean that it's easy or simple to realize in reality. He'll give a couple of historical examples, such as Sparta and the ancient Roman Republic before it became a Roman Empire. But these are ancient, legendary, historical examples. I mean, strictly speaking, he is talking about a highly improbable situation. And Rousseau says this. He says, upon close examination, it will be found that most states do not have laws. They're lawless tyrannies or something like that. And still, again, it's useful to rank the existing regimes and to notice certain tendencies. But at the end of the day, all of this is much less important, because again, if you were University of London students, we wouldn't care about communism at all, because this is not what Marx is about. This is not why Marx is valuable. Marx does not write about communism. Like, Marx wrote 10,000 pages, and you will find maybe 3 or 4 pages where he talks about communism. The rest is Marx's analysis of capitalism. Now this is why Marx is important for us. Analysis of capitalism. And yeah, I think that again, comparing the ideal type of capitalism to the ideal type of communism helps us understand something about capitalism. But per se, this is what we're interested in. We're not. This isn't a class in prophecy and eschatology. We aren't trying to predict the future in this class. We're trying to understand the present. This is the point of philosophy. This is the point of social theory. And I talked about this last time. Marxist conservatism. Marx thinks that. Communism is not about building sand castles in the sky. Communism is about understanding the real tendencies which exist in society today. And at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is that it's much more important for Marx to understand the present than to predict the future. So we can bracket this whole question. Okay, let me shut up and erase all this. If you want to continue talking about this, maybe we could devote a certain time in the seminar, although I think that we have a much more interesting task today. So today, we're going to talk about a very special philosopher who's very special to me, whose name is Karl Emil Maximilian Weber. Now he's special to me because I don't really understand Weber as much as I want to. I mean, Durkheim is like gets a borderline pass in this course. I was seriously considering dropping Durkheim, but Weber is core, definitely core. And of the core philosophers, unfortunately, my grip on Weber, and this again is I'm not sure why I'm talking about this, well, parties, again, maybe a reminder for myself of something to do during the summer. I should get more into Weber, because the more I read Weber, the more I realize that I don't know, it's extremely fruitful and productive in all sorts of ways. And actually, this year when I have been rereading Weber, I realized that my exposition of Marx is very Weberian. Am I a Weberian Marxist? That's an interesting question, because I understand Marx primarily in Weberian terms, beginning with this notion of ideal types, which I keep talking about. And there is a deep affinity. There is a deep affinity between Weber and Marx. I think this is not going to this gets people upset, but I would actually insist on calling Weber a certain kind of Marxist. Although people don't usually they don't do it. Although some people do. I mean, Weber in certain circles is actually known as the bourgeois Marx. Some of his detractors called him that. And in general, Max Weber witnessed the fin de siècle, the golden age of Europe at the end of the 19th century, and the descent of Europe into the madness of the First World War, and died shortly after First World War from Spanish flu, which was the most fortunate event in terms of his career, because if he didn't die, he very likely would not be studying Weber in class today, for reasons I'll explain in a couple minutes. Or maybe I won't explain them, but at least I'll hint. Anyway, so the two most important philosophers for Weber are Marx and Nietzsche. He wrote this himself, Marx and Nietzsche. And I agree, two most important philosophers for me are also Marx and Nietzsche. And this is immediately one reason for me to pay extra attention to Weber. Marx and Nietzsche. And he's writing in response to Marx. He will criticize certain things in Marx, but I think at the end of the day, I don't see any deep disagreement between Marx and Weber. And in fact, I have to tell you that and I'm gonna make this explicit in a couple moments. I understand Marx in exactly Weberian terms. When we talk about Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, by the way, I will tell you about how the argument in this book is probably inadequate, but to the extent that it is adequate, I think it's not a criticism, it is a vindication of Marx's analysis. And when Francis Fukuyama, of all people, in the End of History and The Last Man, uses Weber to criticize Marx, he doesn't understand what he's talking about. He doesn't understand Marx, he doesn't understand Weber, and the way he conflates the two is just it's just a shame. It's what's the right phrase? Yeah, shame, blunder, horrible blunder. Anyway, but I'll vindicate both, hopefully, Marx and Weber in a second. Anyway, so what does he take from Marx and Nietzsche? Well, what he takes from Nietzsche is, I guess, two things, which your Homo Simon talks about. So the first one is the primacy of power. Primacy of power. Why don't you just write the word power? Everything is power. So very important, social relations. But also economic relations, but also international relations are relations of power. Weber actually, in his life, he was a person of many talents. He was an historian, a sociologist, a jurist, but he liked to call himself an economist. And this is potentially a very explosive topic. I don't want to talk about this too much, but for some reason, reading Weber seems to teach me slightly more than reading about economics than reading your economic textbooks. I'm not exactly sure why is that. Maybe there are some economic textbooks which I have somehow went under my radar. But if that's so, you can tell me during the break. Basically, and the reason why I think not to overindulge in judgmental jargon, but the ultimate reason why I think Weber is in a position to understand the whole sphere of economy and economics much better than your neoclassic textbooks is because he understands that economic relations are relations of power. First and foremost, again, in the shop floor, what we have is a relationship of power between the employer and the employee, and between market power between participants in the economic sphere, and the way in which economics and politics are not really separate in real life. Economics and politics are deeply intertwined. Economics influences politics, and politics influences economics back, and economic power is translatable into political power. And again, in our contemporary system, with a very high degree of monopolization, shows the danger and in fact the absurdity of trying to separate politics from economics. Anyway, so this is what Marx. This is what Weber gets from Nietzsche. What he gets from Marx is the understanding of structural forces. Structural forces. And Weber is a very interesting philosopher because, on the one hand, I mean, usually the way he's taught in courses like these is that, well, we have these structural positivist approaches. People like Durkheim, people like Marx, people like the Darwinists whom we talked about in the first part of the course, people like maybe Daniel Dennett, if you want. And then opposed to them, there is this maybe neo-Kantian tradition that pays attention to particular individual freedom. Maybe, let's get Descartes on the board, right? Maybe trying to rescue Descartes, at least to some extent. And Weber begins in this vein. There's a very famous and very important, if this was a proper philosophy of science course, first of all, you would not be here because it would be boring as death. But if this was a proper philosophy of science course, we would talk about this. This is a very famous thing called very famous event called the Methodenstreit, the dispute about method, which occurred in Germany roughly, at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. And one of the contentions was, should society be understood in a positivist law-like fashion? Basically, the kinds of things that we talked about in the first part of the course, especially through this evolutionary analogy, or are human beings irreducible? Are human beings things of their own? Is this the social sciences, the Geisteswissenschaft? Is this a different sphere which is not amenable, which is not susceptible to standard positivist analysis? And Weber starts on that side of the debate. He starts as a critic of me. He starts as this Cartesian guy in this course who tries to destroy this. But if you read Weber carefully, and I was taking this from Michael Borovoy, but I realized that another textbook that University of London Social Theory uses by George Ritzer. George Ritzer basically spends all of his chapter, like every sentence, every second sentence, every paragraph, he talks about how Weber constantly contradicts himself, how Weber gives himself a methodological instruction and then immediately violates it. So it's not just Borovoy, but also Ritzer is good enough. So the idea is that, again, Weber fails in this to the extent that he is a sociologist, to the extent that he's a productive sociologist. He has to explain things through what he calls iron cages. Iron cage, Steinhartes Gehäuse in German. So this is the notion being that human beings begin as free actors. They freely choose certain things, but then the systematic fallout of their action acquires a life of its own, a logic of its own, a dynamic of its own. Dynamic of its own. And appears as something external and, more importantly, coercive. How, for example, Weber's going to say that capitalism in the beginning, at least to some extent, is a product of free agency, free human agency, although if you explain everything through iron cage, where is really the place for human agency? That's a complicated question. Anyway, so if there are certain, even if there are certain traces of human agency at the beginning of the process of emergence of capitalism, by the time capitalism matures, it becomes an iron cage. It has a dynamic of its own and exists as an external and coercive force, no longer having anything to do with human freedom. So again, to the extent that sociology explains, even to the extent that Weberian sociology explains anything, it explains through this notion of iron cages, again, which have nothing to do with human agency or freedom or human free choice. Okay. So let me start somewhere, and then we'll see how it goes. So again, I remind you that for all the social theorists whom we're talking about, the main question is always the transition from pre-modern to modern societies. So transition, which is again in the works of Karl Marx, centers around the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution always being probably much more important than the French Revolution. Again, according to the Marxist analysis, French Revolution was brought about by the rise of the bourgeoisie, by the economic factors, at least to some extent. Well, to a large extent. Anyway, so let me start far away, and our goal is to get to capitalism. Yeah. So Weber will talk about explaining action and explaining authority. So action and authority, action and authority. When we talk about action, what kind of action do we mean? And the answer is any kind of action. Tying your shoes, getting married, electing officials, choosing careers, whatever. Social action, any kind of social action. And Weber says that there are 4 types of social action. Types. Now, when we talk about types, of course, we are talking about this wonderful phrase, the ideal types. And I keep mentioning this for 6 or 7 classes in a row now, so I hope you by now understand what I'm talking about. But this is Weber's original contribution, this notion of an ideal type, which he calls an einseitige Steigerung, the one-sided accentuation. So a certain idealized model. Again, ideal type does not mean something good, right? It means like same way that you can use a geometric model, let's say like a model of a triangle, to model, I don't know, engineering or construction works. In the same fashion, you use ideal types to model social reality. So, and again, a simple physical example of an ideal type would be I let go of this marker and it falls down, the marker falls down. There are all sorts of forces which influences the falling down of the marker. I mean, the blood circulating in your veins, the cells of your blood have a certain gravitational pull. So each and every one, if I were to write a perfect equation which would perfectly explain the fall down of the marker, I would have to take into account all of this, including the blood cells, including the firing of the neurons, including the gravitational pull of Alpha Centauri, and the black hole at the center of our galaxy. This equation would be huge. It would be impossible to calculate. But, says Weber, we can abstract. So an ideal type, if you want, is an abstract generalization. And what he calls, actually the word map is also a very good word to describe this. Anyway, so you oversimplify the situation and you make certain features of it stand out. Again, one-sided accentuation, one-sided exaggeration. So you imagine that this marker is a point and that the Earth is a point. And you just calculate these 2 points with the only characteristic mass. And you calculate how fast the marker will fall. And this gives you approximately the right answer. And Weber is going to say that the real type, so the reality as it exists, is a combination of ideal types. So that's how it works. Again, in physics, but also very importantly in social reality. Now I talked about this, a map. I'm not sure if this is a deep point, and I could spend maybe half an hour talking about this. But think about this. Think about this in your own spare time. So if you were to draw a map of this room, there are certain things which you would exaggerate. There are certain things that you would omit on your map. So maybe you would draw the tables in this room. Or let's say if you're looking at Pokrovka Street, right, the map of Moscow. So there are certain things that you draw on a map, like again streets and traffic crossings and traffic lights. But there are other things like cigarette butts that you don't draw, or tree stumps. So there are certain things which you accentuate, and there are certain things which you de-accentuate. Certain things which you don't include in your map. And again, a perfect map of a given territory would have to be as large as the given territory. It's an interesting thought. First time I heard this phrase in the works of Jorge Luis Borges, I did not understand it the first time I saw it. But if you think about this very carefully, a perfect map of a given environment has to be as large as the environment. Only by abstracting certain things, only by performing this ideal typical reduction of the world can we get maps which are useful. Anyway, so this is what Weber is talking about. So again, ideal types will isolate certain tendencies within the world. Okay, so this marker is falling. And the reality of the marker falling can be decomposed, can be deconstructed into various components. The most important component is the gravitational pull of the Earth, but there are all sorts of others which we forget to talk about. So likewise, Weber is going to say when you talk about human action, usually you can describe it as embodying one particular ideal type, or maybe a combination of a couple. But actually, in reality, it's always going to be the combination of all 4. So all action is always a combination of all 4 types. So these 4 types are what he calls the traditional action, the affective action. And these ones are very characteristically pre-modern. You know what? Let me not write 1, 2, 3, and 4. Let me write A, B, C, and D. Why? Because I'm not talking about any kind of logical order. These are just 4 aspects. Indeed, these are pre-modern, but they also exist in modern times. Obviously. So, and the last 2 are instrumentally rational action and value rational action. So, value rational action, that's rational, and instrumentally rational action with sec rational. So this would be value, and this would be instrument. And they characteristically emerge in modern times. They characteristically emerge in modern times. However, I remind you that our action today is a combination of all four. And actually effective action is going to play a very important role for Weber. So traditional action, it's very interesting. Sometimes I lament that I have to teach so many courses at the same time, but sometimes it's useful and interesting. We talked about David Hume the other day, and David Hume talks about how actually most of social reality is based on habit. Like most of the decisions you make in life, says David Hume, you don't really calculate, you don't really think, you don't really have any particular reason to do this or that. You are doing things out of habit. Well, Weber has the formal definition. He says that you perform certain actions out of belief in the sanctity of tradition since time immemorial. Well, when you brush your teeth before you go to bed, something tells me you don't really do this out of belief in sanctity of tradition from time immemorial. You do this out of habit, custom or habit. And immediately, this is going to be important because this will relate to forms of power. Oh, by the way, we talked about Nietzsche, and I had point A, but forgot to mention point B. So the other thing that Weber takes from Nietzsche is Nietzsche's perspectivism, Nietzsche's relativism and perspectivism. The idea that, first of all, values have no rational grounding. So at bottom, human life is irrational. Values have no rational ground. And secondly, that the value system that you have structures the way you look at the world. This is usually called perspectivism. But again, think back to Kant last year, that you do not see the world as it really is, but it is affected by the makeup of your consciousness, by the makeup of your head, if you want. But also, among other things, very importantly affected by values. So, let me go back to this picture. So traditional action corresponds to, so these would be examples of action. Traditional action corresponds to what Weber calls traditional authority. Traditional authority. So we said action and authority. Traditional authority. And Weber, when he talks about authority, again, Weber is very unapologetic about this. He says authority is legitimate domination. So some subjects in a given political system exercise power over others, dominate over others. And a little bit like Foucault, Weber wants to draw our attention to the fact that most of the time power is exercised without active resistance. That again, social order is possible because the people over whom power is exercised recognize power as legitimate. Again, when a policeman stops me in the street and asks me or demands that I show my papers, I recognize this as legitimate, at least to some extent. And again, so action talks about all social action, and these types of authority refer to actions which people perform in response to political commands within a given social system. So traditional authority. So the second, so again, what is traditional authority? The examples which are usually given is if you imagine a small village, small medieval village, and let's say you have a priest in a village, and a priest, by tradition, has certain things that the priest is simply allowed to do, and this is rooted in custom. People accept this unreflectively. It's not like they have a deep reason. It's just that this is the way this has always been done. And again, I remind you that Weber is going to insist that all four types of actions are present today in contemporary world, and all three types of authority are present today. So when you stop before a red light in a street, probably this is traditional action. This is action done out of unreflective habit. And when I said this 5 seconds ago, when a policeman asks you for your papers and you give the papers, maybe that's also traditional authority, at least to some extent, or maybe to a large extent, because you don't actually think, or you sit there quietly and listen to what I'm saying. Isn't this traditional authority of a teacher? Anyway, so the second type of action is affective action, and this corresponds to charismatic authority. Charismatic authority. So affective action is, again, action done in a fit of passion. Something that you do under a grip of a strong emotion. And charismatic authority. I think the examples which Weber himself gives are Muhammad, Jesus, and Buddha. Maybe. Yes, I think so. Anyway, so, but there are important differences because Buddha leads by example, and Christ and Muhammad are ethical teachers according to Weber, and there's a difference, but I don't want to go there. Anyway, so yeah, so let's say Muhammad, charismatic authority. So a person has certain qualities that, I don't want to use the word hypnotize, but something like that impress people, that inspire a belief in superhuman abilities or superhuman capacities of a person. I think Lenin is often also given as an example of a charismatic authority for Weber. And the last type sort of is a combination of these two, I guess, value rational and instrumentally rational. And this is what Weber calls legal rational authority. Although I have to tell you that my thinking on the issue actually leads me to conclude that maybe we are mostly interested in instrumental rationality when we talk about legal rational authority. I'll explain why in a second. And legal rational authority, you obey because you believe in the proper procedural basis of the exercise of authority. So again, and remember, real types, a combination of all three ideal types. So there's a policeman who stops you in the street. First of all, it's traditional that you stop and answer his questions. Second, maybe the policeman has a certain charisma. Happens a lot. I mean, and again, Weber talks about this institutionalization of charisma. Doesn't the profession of a policeman impart a certain charisma to you? Doesn't the profession of a teacher impart a certain charisma to you? It's an interesting question. Anyway, and the last point, again, one reason why you show the policeman your papers is because you believe in the proper formal grounding of the procedure. Not just because it's always been done this way, not just because of the emotions, but actually there's also a proper procedure according to which the policeman has a right to demand these papers. And this proper procedure, again, like in a value rational action, you would have to say that the procedure actually ultimately at the end of the day reinforces my goals. So it's like a little bit like Rousseau's general will. I want to live in a society which has peace and order. So peace and order are my values, and I believe that everybody showing their papers to the policeman is actually good for the society and therefore good for me. That I, in a direct or an indirect fashion, derive utility from this. So I value peace. Peace is my value, and therefore I submit to the policeman. But how many people actually think that? How many people are actually able to make this connection between the values and the proper procedure? What Weber emphasizes over and over again, first you have value rational action, and then instrumentally rational action develops. And instrumentally rational action develops in the following fashion: that within our society we have a certain standard, maybe culturally relative, but still, we have a certain standard of rationality. We have a certain standard of things which are considered to be rational. This is the way we do things. This is the proper way to do things. Not because necessarily I have a certain value, but because I have a certain conception of what is reasonable. This transition is a deeply important, to some extent ominous transition. If you want, the one way to not necessarily nuance, but maybe illustrate. It's not a perfect illustration, but one way to imperfectly illustrate this conception of instrumental rationality is this notion of efficiency for the sake of efficiency. Efficiency simply for the sake of efficiency. Not because it leads to some goal which is good for me, not because there's some outcome, not because there's something in it for me, but because this is efficiency for efficiency's sake. So this, I think, is a very important distinction, at least for me today. This is the most important distinction, and this is something I'm trying to think through. And actually, last year when I was giving this lecture, I did not understand this distinction. And in the course of last year's lecture, I think I managed to get a certain grip, and I'm going to try to share my understanding with you. Having said that, I shudder to think how many professors of sociology actually do understand this distinction, even though they teach their students this every day without necessarily understanding what actually Weber is talking about. Anyway, so well, in order to really properly explain this transition, we need to talk about capitalism. So, but I'm not sure. Let me try to do it in the following, not very orderly fashion. Let me try to give you a preliminary explanation. Then we'll talk about capitalism, and then I'll return back to this point, because to some extent, maybe this is the most important point in all of Max Weber. So, again, so you wake up in the morning, and you do certain things. For example, you like coffee, and you decide, I want to buy myself a coffee machine. You open some Yandex Market or something like that, and you see what kind of coffee machines are available. You read some reviews, that kind of thing. You think about your budget, your credit card, that kind of thing, and you rationally decide what kind of coffee machine to buy. This is a value rational action. It's a value rational. Your value is a cup of coffee. By the way, Weber takes this from Nietzsche, this idea that values are in constant conflict. He says, warring gods. One of the sections in your home assignment is called Warring Gods, or War of Gods. That values are incommensurable, and that we're doomed. Again, so is Weber ultimately the most conflictual philosopher in this course? Maybe yes. Because you see, for Marx, at the end of times in communism, at least in the ideal time of communism, there isn't supposed to be any conflict. But for Weber, there is this irreducible conflictual nature of human society. He takes this from Nietzsche, that again, we don't have, values are not given to us. We decide on what our values are going to be. And because we decide on what the values are going to be, necessarily it could lead to irreconcilable conflict. Again, this existential struggle. Oh, interesting parallels here between Max Weber and Carl Schmitt, who had the great fortune to die of Spanish flu. My brother wrote to me this morning. He's in Germany. He said, "Oh, you have a lecture on Weber today, and I'm driving through Max Weber Platz." Well, there's a deep reason why Germany has Max Weber Platz, but not Carl Schmitt Platz or not Martin Heidegger Platz. And again, we can thank Spanish flu for that. Anyway, I'm sorry. I digress. Let me go back to this. So again, War of Gods, existential struggle, friend and enemy. This notion again in Carl Schmitt that you can really have enemies, truly true enemies. Enemies in the sense of your values are different and irreconcilable. This is not the case for Marx. But at least again, in the way that he reconstructs this ideal type communism, at the end of days, even if your values are different, it doesn't matter. We have enough space. And in fact, your freedom will never restrict my freedom. Your freedom enables my freedom in communism. He does not believe in this. Whereas Weber does very much. And Weber will talk about what kind of values is Weber talking about. He says, well, some people following John Stuart Mill think about comfort, and he scathingly talks about Switzerland. Not a great nation, but just, it's a rural republic which is fortunate enough to survive because it's shielded by mountains from the outside world. But he says, what we have to leave to our descendants, is not comfort, but a great nation. He talks about this. So these are values. Do you value your own personal comfort? Do you value utility, or do you value the greatness of your nation? And I think it's a deep mistake of game theorists to think that allegiance to greatness of a nation plays no part in human affairs. This is one of the reasons why so many of American young soldiers died in Vietnam, not understanding that that sort of you cannot take oversimplified quasi-economic game theoretical model and hope to explain human behavior. This is real motivation, and people do actually, as a matter of fact, sacrifice their own well-being. Two such things as a greatness of a nation. Well, anyway, he also talks about this elbow room, and so the necessity of actually conquest abroad. So says our successors will hold us answerable to history, not primarily for the kind of economic organization we hand down to them. By the way, so he doesn't care about this. Capitalism, socialism, doesn't matter. Who cares? We need to pick the one which is more efficient, and in principle he doesn't think that one is necessarily in principle more efficient than the other. Anyway, not the economic system, but the amount of elbow room we conquer and bequeath to them. In final analysis, process of economic development are power struggles too. The same great risk that all trading industrial people of the past All leading people in cultural development in the past, at the time of their greatness, have taken upon themselves, and it is in my opinion, that we are not pursuing policy of national comfort, but national greatness. Not national comfort, but national greatness. Hence, we must take this burden upon our shoulders if we wish to have a national existence other than that of Switzerland, for example. Yeah. Eternal struggle to preserve and raise the quality of our national species. Interesting questions. Anyway, so, but is this relevant today? It is, very much. Not just in Germany after the First World War. Although this is the immediate context in which Weber is obviously writing. And when he talks about this international struggle and the prospect of Germany becoming something like the colony of the United Kingdom, I mean, this, in 1919, this is very much a prospect which is on the table. Well, much more to be said about this. Are European countries to some extent today colonies of America? I don't know. It's an interesting question, huh?
What do you mean by efficiency? Or
what? I'm getting there. Thank you. I should be getting there right now. So let me go back here. So anyway, so you have all of this discussion of elbow room started with a very innocuous question that you have in your morning: which coffee machine should you buy? So let's go back. Let's forget about the elbow room. Let's go back to the coffee machine. So a value rational action is, again, you buy the coffee machine. So you choose rationally. You calculate means and ends. But what is an instrumentally rational action? An instrumentally rational action, so a value rational action is you have a value given to you by your biology, by your culture, by your whatever. So you have a certain value and you try to maximize this value. But an instrumentally rational action is where, in a very strange phrase, Weber says that not only the means, but also the goal is chosen rationally. Not only the means, but also the goal is chosen rationally. But Weber, Marx, Karl Emil, haven't you read Nietzsche? Haven't you read Kant? Haven't you read Hume? Don't you know that values cannot be chosen rationally? And Weber knows this. So it's not like you choose the value rationally. But there's a certain system of efficiency which tells you what is the efficient way to bring up your children, or to organize your life, or to, let's say, run a business. And again, we need to get to capitalism. So let me finish with this silly example, and then we'll talk about capitalism. So again, when I choose a coffee machine, means and ends, and so I wake up in the morning, I choose the coffee machine, I have delivery next day, and I enjoy my coffee in the evening. This is value rational action. What is instrumentally rational action? Well, again, Marx is going to say that cat has a cat nature, dog has a dog nature, but human beings do not have human nature. Animals produce particularly, but human beings have this capacity to produce universally. So, like a human being is a universal instrument. You can take a human being and make it produce whatever. And this is exactly what happens in society. I mean, this is one of the points of Marx's critique of capitalism, that differently abled people with different abilities, all perform the same tasks on the conveyor belt of contemporary capitalism. That anybody can be anything. I was listening to this portion of the home assignment, and the delivery man came to deliver something, and I immediately asked myself, is this person who's delivering cat food to me, is he like a born delivery man? And so you remember Plato, or remember Durkheim, this notion that we have hierarchy of talents, and it gets mapped on. So these are talents, and this is division of labor. Is it the case that talents get mapped onto the division of labor? And sort of here at the bottom of the pyramid, we have a born drivers, born janitors, born carpenters and shoemakers. No, of course not. The economic system forces people, regardless of what your natural abilities are, into particular slots, and anybody can be anything. We talked about this last time. It's very important for Marx in a positive sense because this enables our freedom in communism, but it's also important for both Marx and Weber in the negative sense in capitalism today, that anybody can do anything. And if economic necessity forced you, any one of you could be an accountant, or a doctor, or a lawyer, or a politician, or a shoemaker, or a delivery man. Anybody, including you or me. Again, do individual talents matter? I suppose they do, but at the end of the day, anybody can be even a brain surgeon. It's a question of technique. Yeah, you can be a better or a worse brain surgeon, but you can be an acceptable brain surgeon. And again, when children decide, I want to do surgery for a living, do they really know what their talents are? Isn't it the case that so much more important is what happens to them during the 5 years of education than the inborn talents? Anyway, I don't want to continue this. line of reasoning. But again, let me go back to this point. That, again, human beings, Marx says, produce universally. They have this capacity to perform tasks well, perform tasks efficiently, regardless of whether they want to or not. Again, a person who's making shoes in a factory is not the same person. The process of making shoes in a factory is rational, but it's rational in a different sense than your process of choosing the coffee machine. Okay, let me maybe simplify this example. So when you choose a coffee machine for yourself, and you calculate means and ends, this is a very rational action. But let's suppose you own a coffee shop, and you are choosing a coffee machine to maximize your profits. Again, you see, it has nothing to do with your values. And again, what is this efficiency determined by? Well, it's determined by the laws of the market. Laws of the market. And you could say that at the end of the day you want profit because money that you get can be used for things, but that's not true. Again, people earn money, and people who really earn a lot of money consume a tiny portion of it, or consume none at all. And this is important for Marx. This is also very important for Weber. Weber says this is how capitalism gets going. Capitalism gets going because of a certain form of asceticism, for pursuing profit for profit's sake. Again, efficiency for the sake of efficiency, profit for the sake of profit, not to be enjoyed, never to be enjoyed. Again, in this example, profit for the sake of profit. In this example of a coffee machine, you will enjoy your coffee next evening. But in the case of the way market is organized, when will you enjoy your coffee? Never. I mean, this is our civilization is one huge sham of this deferred gratification. You're a child, and parents tell you, well, you get, you'll grow up, you'll get to enjoy this or that, forbidden pleasure or what have you. And when you're like right now, you're in school and say, yeah, you have to suffer through 4 years of ISIS, but then later, and then you suffer through 2 years of master's diploma or some damn fool MBA or what have you, right? And then you get your job, and you work 16 hours a day, and people constantly tell you, but you'll enjoy it later. You'll enjoy it later. When will you enjoy it? When you're dead, I suppose. Or you're enrolling into the best school in order to guarantee yourself a place in the best retirement home, something like that. So, weird, but that's the point. You never enjoy it. People do it not again like this is an ideal type. This is an ideal type. Remember, this is an ideal type. You can obviously certainly find counterexamples, but it's not like you're a drug addict who's looking for a fix and you do just whatever you can through the day in order to get your fix in the evening with the money that you get. No, this is deferred gratification. You do your job the best way you can, and in fact, again, the degree of skill and the degree of your dedication to your job is not really correlated with the amount of money that you get at the end of the day. Again, especially if you look at this, econometrically, what kind of jobs, pay what kind of money. And again, if you think of brain neurosurgeons, so the example we kept using last time, so by no means the highest paid profession, but the dedication is there. Anyway, it's a complicated story, but. So I'm trying to circle around this issue of human beings being able to perform tasks well with extreme dedication, even though there's nothing in it for them, which ultimately leads to this notion of efficiency for the sake of efficiency. But when I say efficiency for the sake of efficiency, ultimately, what am I talking about? Well, Weber is very clear. Who sets the standard of efficiency? What is considered efficient? The process of competition in the market and in the political sphere. So we are talking about competition, political and economic competition. So this is how we define efficiency: political and economic competition, which are external coercive forces which have dynamic of their own and in fact form the iron cages which regulate our lives. Okay. If this is not very clear, let me get to the most important example in Weber. So this is an example, again, Protestant, the most famous book, Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. I shouldn't say this, but this story brings so much consolation to me every time I read it. Weber was a very precocious student. He got a professor's post at a relatively young age, and then he had a quarrel with his father, and for 7 years he was in a state of complete nervous breakdown. For 7 years he did not, so he got professor's post. For 7 years, he was basically lying on a bed like a vegetable. And then, when he got back up, his first book was The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. So it gives a lot of hope, I think, to a lot of people, especially to me. I don't know. can we? Well, let me go. Sorry, stop this autobiographical tribulations and go back to the book itself. Anyway, so first of all, this is a great book, very important book for contemporary sociology. It's called Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. It's very important. It's not Protestant ethic and capitalism. It's Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Now, specifically, I should have tried to leave myself more space, but whatever. Specifically, Weber is trying to some extent in response to Marx, trying to map out the history of the emergence of capitalism, of what can be mnemonically called modern, Western, bourgeois, rational capitalism, plus capitalism plus bureaucracy. This is the modern world. Modern world is this: modern, Western, bourgeois, rational capitalism and bureaucracy. This is the modern world. Now, the reason this is a mnemonic device because this is Max Weber, so you will never forget this, hopefully. Modern, Western, bourgeois, rational capitalism plus bureaucracy. We'll talk about bureaucracy in a second. So it's a very important transformation. Now again, is Weber arguing against Marx? Not exactly. So I don't know. I think we don't need this. So but let me signal. So we're talking about traditional authority. Here we're talking about charismatic authority, and here we're talking about legal rational authority. Anyway, so Marx says, Weber says that what is required in order to get capitalism going are 6 factors. So the first one is, I'm not sure, are these factors important? See, often there are certain things which seem important in Weber, I'm not sure how important they are. When I write them on the board and certain interesting ideas come to mind. So I'm not sure if this is too important, but let me write this out and see if we can go somewhere from here. So first thing he says, you need formally free labor. Formally free labor. Now it's important, and Weber stresses this over and over again. He agrees with Marx completely. When you say formally free labor, you're not actually talking about free people. To work or not to work is not a free choice in any shape, manner, or form. Labor is free in a sense that it's not owned, in a sense that like you don't have slavery or serfdom. Very interesting question. Could you have capitalism with slavery? With legal slavery? Because Marx thinks no. And Marx's idea basically is this, that slavery, if you can own people, this creates certain interesting dynamic in the labor market, which which reduces competition, and this is bad. And so in order to have competition as much as possible, you need formally free labor. Basically, you need to be able, when somebody goes bankrupt, all of his workers can be rehired on a new factory tomorrow. And if you have formal slavery, this will not happen. And this is why Marx thinks that, again, not out of benevolence, but for purely a reason of economic efficiency, slavery disappears. That's a good question. Could you think of a different system? It's the kind of question that keeps me up at night. I don't know. But Weber agrees with Marx that at least initially you need to free labor. By the way, it could be the case that originally freeing the workers is important to break down the traditional structures of authority. But once capitalism gets going, you can breed people like cattle and use them as slaves. That's an interesting thought. I need to think about that. I need to think about that some more. Because slavery under capitalism, either Weber would agree with us. Either we are going back to re-feudalization, which is one step backwards, or find new ways to use slaves, which is a step forwards in terms of efficiency. And these would be different options. And re-feudalization, right? What is re-feudalization? Look outside the window. Modern Russia is re-feudalization. This is Weber's worst nightmare. He, again, very concerned with the greatness of the German nation, and he was afraid that the bourgeois capital that basically big money would use economic power, translate it into political power, and get back feudal privileges. And he was afraid that what this was going to lead to is that Germany becomes less competitive and loses to England. And in the end, Germany merely becomes a Switzerland. Yeah, not necessarily become a colony in this, but at least lose the status of the great power. Because, again, this notion that everybody keeps talking about, but also Marx, very important to remember. For Marx, capitalism is the best thing that has ever happened. This internal dynamism of capitalism through competition, and refeudalization is driving out the competition, bracketing out the competition and going back to old, traditional, patrimonial modes of relation. I should talk about that, but actually with respect to Weber's analysis of bureaucracy in a second. Anyway, so when we talk about this formal freedom, he says, Weber and Marx talk about double freedom. So the worker is free to choose any employer to work for, but at the same time, the worker is free from means of subsistence. The worker does not have means of subsistence, so that actually he's forced to work for somebody. So it's a free in double sense. Free in the positive sense that he can choose whom to work for, but free in the negative sense that he has to choose at least one, or else he'll die of starvation. Again, this quote from Homo Simon, that only when in consequence of the existence of workers who in the formal sense voluntarily, but actually under the compulsion of the whip of hunger, offer themselves, so only in those circumstances, the cost of products may be unambiguously determined in advance. So predictability, which is necessary for capitalism, requires that you have people who are forced to work by the whip of hunger for fixed wages, such that it makes production predictable, production costs predictable into the future, something like that. So this is point number one. I promise I'll rush through other points more quickly. So the second one, he talks about the separation of home and work. Immediately last year we had this interesting discussion of how actually today we, sort of with freelance and all that stuff, work goes back home. But the way to understand this process is that it used to be that your life was yours and it was home and you worked at home. Then there's a separation of home and work. And today in the 21st century, you get this notion where all of your life is work. You don't have a home anymore. This is freelance. Freelance is not back here. Freelance is that you don't have a home anymore. You work. Everything that you do, you have to do in order to get your minimum wage or something like that. Think of the plight of YouTubers or something like that. I don't know. Let me erase this. But why is separation of home and work important? Because in the workplace you have this special domain of rationality, especially special domain of instrumental rationality. Okay, the third one is, you love this, double entry bookkeeping. But specifically he means rational calculation of means and ends. Number 4 is rule of law. Both Marx and Weber would emphasize this, rule of law, that in order for business to thrive, in order for competition to thrive, you need settled, standing, transparent laws without corruption, that kind of thing. Again, look outside the window. Number 5, he talks about technical science, like rational practical knowledge. I'm just going to write science. And when he talks about all of this, he says, well, is this enough for capitalism? And Weber says, no, because all of this existed in China and to some extent in India. And he says they did not become capitalists because they did not have the final element, element number 6, which is deeply irrational. He talks about the spirit of capitalism, And the spirit of capitalism is the idea of accumulation for the sake of accumulation. Accumulation for the sake of accumulation, profit for the sake of profit. Not profit for consumption, but profit for the sake of profit. And what this provides is a very important idea which you don't really study here, which speaks volumes about the quality of your economic, quote-unquote, education. This is the primitive accumulation of capital. Primitive accumulation of capital, which is a necessary process, according to Marx and Weber and many other economists, which is a necessary process to get capitalism going. This period of initial investment, like when you need to have free available money that you can invest basically in technology. And this is how capitalism gets going for the first time. And again, so this is very much going to be linked to technological progress. But you need this primitive accumulation of capital. And in order to get primitive accumulation of capital, you have to, the things that you, the money that you own, you should not consume. You should reinvest it. And so all of these are, strictly speaking for Marx, this would be economic base. But this is not economic base, it's a superstructure. This is values. And so where do these values come from? And Weber is going to talk about, and we could spend a lot of time talking about this, but let me cut the story short. He talks about Calvinism. How Calvinism was uniquely suited to provide this basis. And we can talk about this if you want more in the seminar, but the idea was that in Calvinism, for weird theological reasons, for completely random theological reasons, work was seen as duty, as religious duty. That again, to contrast this with Catholicism, where you have work as penitence. Work as penitence. So the work that you do in order to get absolved of sins. But he said that Weber imagines that in monasteries, or again in general in Catholicism, what you do is you sin, and then you repent, you've done your work, and you go back to your business as usual. So this cycle of sin and repentance. But what happens in Calvinism is that no, you are sinful from the time you were born, and everybody, most people are destined to burn in hell. And so everybody has to work all the time. And working is your religious duty. There's also this interesting issue, if you want we can talk about this more in the seminar, of signs. How actually success in work is sign that God loves you. Notice, very importantly, not success in consumption, but success in business, just success by itself. The fact that your business is prosperous, but you don't consume anything, you reinvest. Everything that you have, you reinvest. And also, very importantly, again, vis-a-vis the values of the Middle Ages, the fact that being successful in business is seen as a virtue and not as a vice. And Weber says this is completely random, and this, in a unique fashion, suits capitalism, and this is what allows to get capitalism going. So many things to talk about in relation to this. I don't have a lot of time. So let me try to be as quick and as concise, as clear as possible. So the first thing immediately to mention, this is exactly how I understand Marx. For me, this is not a criticism of Marx. This is exactly how I understand Marx. You have transformations in the economic base, which happen for economic reasons, and then you have superstructure, which appears for whichever reason. Now, why is base more primary than the superstructure? Why are we talking about this? Because basically, and this is me, or this is, for example, Jerry Cohen. This is the way that the greatest Marxist of the 21st century, Jerry Cohen, explains Marx. That sort of there's this evolutionary, selective pressure, if you want. That all the possible superstructures, only those survive which fit the economic base. And this is exactly what happened with Calvinism. So there's a transformation in the ideas which happens for random reason, but it gets retained. It gets retained because it fits the base in a very important sense. And Weber agrees with this as well. Weber, if you read very carefully, is a materialist in an important sense. Because, again, who cares about the ideas? Ideas are random. Calvinism and this whole spirit of capitalism takes over only because this leads to a more efficient way of organizing labor. And in fact, this is the origin of capitalism. This is how capitalism, according to Weber, first began. But once capitalism gets going, it doesn't matter if you're a Calvinist or not. Now capitalism exists as this dynamic system of its own and exists as an external and coercive force. So what is he saying? He's saying that in the beginning, you have these weird people with very weird values of profit for profit's sake. This was deeply irrational for crazy religious reasons. So when a Calvinist is working 18 hours a day, this is value rationality. They have this value. They're trying to please God with their work. But now, this turns into instrumental rationality. Because you shouldn't even think about God. In fact, Weber agrees with Nietzsche. Capitalism makes us all atheists. The reason you decided to go to ISIF is not because even those who are religious among you, because you consulted a holy book. Let me repeat this. Even religious students among ISIF enrolled into ISIF not because they consulted a holy book. Even for the students who really think of themselves as devoutly religious, no. You enrolled into ISIF because this was the best choice. Best for what? Best from which standpoint? From the standpoint of efficiency, for the sake of efficiency. Again, Weber, who himself was an atheist, thinks that capitalism makes us all atheists, regardless of our profession. Well, he's also going to talk about how, very interestingly, if you want, you can read this in Ritzer. In Ritzer, there's a small section which I should post. I should post this as a separate reading because it's only 4 pages, but it's fabulous. He talks about how also Calvinism. So he says So you have this ruthless pursuit of economic interest, which is seen as ethical duty, and it permitted unprecedented mercilessness in business, but also silenced potential critics who could not simply reduce these actions to self-interest. So again, so the first thing that Calvinism does is it makes success in business not a vice but a virtue. Second, Calvinism provides the rising capitalist with sober, conscientious, and unusually industrious workmen who clung to their work as to a life purpose willed by God. So first of all, again, success is not a vice but a virtue. And secondly, work, especially for the workers. Don't complain, work. Work, be as productive as possible. Oh, your pay is low. Sorry, Jesus died at the cross and your pay is low. You're complaining. Go back to work. Go back to your factory. So if you want Calvinism as an ideology. And third, Calvinism, again, as an ideology, legitimized unequal stratification system by giving the capitalist the comforting assurance that the unequal distribution of goods of this world was a special dispensation of divine power. So, interesting. Legitimizing existing inequalities. Yeah, some people are richer, some people are poor. It's because God wills it that way. And if you are born poor, that's your station in life. You have to do as much as you can. So, but at the end of the day, at the end of the day, capitalism takes off as a force of its own. Again, it has dynamic of its own, exists as an external and coercive force. We don't have to be Calvinists anymore. In fact, Calvinism disappears and is destroyed by capitalism in an important sense. And Weber, also elsewhere, is going to say that history is not driven by ideas. So Fukuyama is triply wrong when he's reading Weber. He's misreading Weber. Not ideas, but material and ideal interests directly govern men's conduct, says Weber. This is a quote from Weber. Material and ideal interests. So by material interest, he means, obviously in a straightforward fashion, material interest, but ideal interest, things like salvation. I'll get to you in a second. I want to get this out first. So, and again, so this is exactly how I would read Marx. And this is exactly why, for both Marx and Weber, base is more important than the superstructure. Again, Calvinism is important only because it suits the base, and when the base transforms, Calvinism goes out the window. And capitalism becomes this iron cage. Okay, so let's talk about bureaucracy. Well, basically, again, for Weber, our modern system is capitalism plus bureaucracy. And both of them exemplify in a different fashion this drive for efficiency for efficiency's sake. If you want to oversimplify, I said efficiency is defined as through political and economic competition. So capitalism is talking about economic competition, and bureaucracy is talking about political competition. And these are, capitalism and bureaucracy are two mutually reinforcing, most efficient ways to organize, most rational ways to organize a social system in competition with other social systems. And bureaucracy, of course, enters into the market. Firms are organized bureaucratically, according to Weber. Like there's internal bureaucracy within the firm. Think of Google, think of, Apple or Amazon. They are, again, within themselves organized bureaucratically. And then maybe the government bureaucracy also makes use of the free market by taxing the free market and getting the profits. So they are mutually reinforcing. They are mutually reinforcing, but mutually dehumanizing. Again, so Weber keeps talking about this rationalization, and for Weber, rationalization is similar to what early non-scientific humanist Marx calls alienation. And in a certain sense, similar to what Durkheim calls enemy, but not exactly. These three terms are like the sicknesses of modernity, the sicknesses of modern capitalism, which both Marx, Weber, and Durkheim are going to talk about. So again, so this process of what is process of rationalization? We talked about this already. This notion of efficiency for efficiency's sake, when all of your life is taken over by this instrumental rationality, and you don't really get anything in return for it. Again, think back to Daniel Kahneman in terms of experience and remembered utility. Again, this idea that, yeah, maybe I'm suffering, but I redescribe my life as, yes, I'm doing the right thing because, again, you have this narrative of efficiency for efficiency's sake. And I just got to wait a couple of years, which is never going to happen, of course. But, and even if you wait a couple of years and buy a new car, it's an old head in a couple of days, and you have to work even more. So that's the beauty of the system. Mm. So yeah. So what is bureaucracy? Well, when he talks about bureaucracy, he also going to tell us 5 or 6 terms. So he says bureaucracy is organized hierarchically, through jurisdiction, through written documents, expert training, against separation of home and work, and also very importantly, management through rules. Management through rules. And all of this is supposed to. So this is the legal rational authority, the bureaucratic organization, which is most vividly contrasted with the traditional system. Again, if you think of the way things are done in this country very often, again, not through written rules, but through certain spoken words, sometimes hints, only hints, not necessarily strict hierarchy, and not necessarily strict jurisdiction, but if you know a man in the right place, he may have certain connections. And of course, again, at the end of the day, real types are combinations of ideal types. So, Russia is bureaucratic to some extent, but also you can see the ideal type of patrimonialism, or traditional authority, what Weber is going to talk about. And do I want to? I don't have a lot of time, so if this is not very clear, maybe we can go over this in the seminar. So, but let me get to maybe something that Weber was very much interested in. So his question was, where is all this is going? Where is all of this going? And immediately, so he says again that the Puritan wanted to work as a calling. So in this value rational way, the Calvinist is working as a calling, but we are forced to work. Again, this value rational versus instrumentally rational. When the asceticism was carried out of the monastic cells into everyday life and began to dominate worldly morality, it did its part in building the tremendous cosmos of modern economic order. This order is now bound to the technical and economic conditions of machine production, which today determines the lives of all the individuals who are born into this mechanism. We don't choose, we're born into this. Again, Stadthartes becomes the iron cage. Not only those who are directly concerned with economic acquisition, with irresistible force, perhaps it will also determine them until the last ton of fossil coal is burnt. In the Puritan divine's view, the care for the external goods should only lie at the shoulders of a saint like a light cloak, which can be thrown aside at any moment, but the fate decreed that the cloak should become an iron cage. Again, this issue, the last ton of fossil coal is burnt. The last ton of fossil coal is burnt. Are we talking about global warming, pollution, humanity destroying itself like in Marx? Yes! Say hi to rationalization. This is exactly what, this is one potential scenario. But in general, Weber was very pessimistic. He thought that these are very efficient ways to organize system, or to organize the social system. He was thinking about, if you could, well, first of all, he understood history better than most people do. So he knew that Russia had nothing to do with communism. Called Soviet Russia a military dictatorship, seeing it for what it really was. And he thought, it's just more reliance on bureaucracy, less reliance on the market. But it's nothing different in an interesting sense. And by the way, this is the most important and interesting criticism of Marx. Because Marx, when he's talking about communism, he imagines that this will be a more humane society, but at the same time, it's also going to be a more efficient society. And Weber is kind of telling us, no, you cannot be both at the same time. You have to choose one. And I think that's a much deeper problem. And again, Weber says this, and Foucault is going to have some similar concerns. But what is Weber's solution? Should I even talk about Weber's solution? Well, just for fun, let's do. Weber's solution, well, first of all, he was very pessimistic, so it's not clear if he realistically thought that there was a solution to this problem. And some of his students, Frankfurt School, were very careful readers of Weber, and Jürgen Habermas, for example, is also a very careful reader of Weber. So they will hope that maybe the forces of democracy can somehow, so democracy versus bureaucracy, that maybe the forces of democracy can somehow win over this, against this bureaucratic system. And again, Jürgen Habermas, who's hopefully still alive, still hopes to this day that maybe democracy from within itself will find certain means to resist the rationality of democracy will carve a certain space against the rationality of the market and the rationality of bureaucratic organization. Again, the domination of our lives by market spheres and political spheres. But Weber himself, I'm not sure how seriously he meant this. I'm not sure how hopeful he was that this was going to happen. He's talking about the so-called plebiscitary democracy, where, because again, remember, he's a Nietzschean. his idea was that, yes, bureaucracy is this stagnant system of rationalization for rationalization's sake, but once every 4 years, we elect a charismatic leader. Charismatic authority is very important in contemporary time. We elect a charismatic leader, a Nietzschean Übermensch, who will stand above the system of capitalism and bureaucracy. And this Nietzschean Übermensch will impart values top to bottom from the top of the system, sort of hijack the system from above to below. But very importantly, again, so like in John Stuart Mill or Edmund Burke, we are not electing our representatives. We are electing people who are better than us. We are electing this one semi-divine person, a little bit maybe like a Rousseauian lawgiver. And very importantly, once the people cast their vote, so in a democracy, so this is Max Weber talking to Erich Ludendorff. You might have heard this name before, a very famous general from the First World War. Again, in a democracy, the people choose the leader whom they trust. Then the chosen leader says, "Now shut your mouth and obey me." So this is what he's talking about, and this is called plebiscitary democracy. I used to teach this course a while back, and plebiscitary democracy, very interesting phrase, plebiscitary democracy. How do you say this? How do you say this in German? Do you know how you say this in German? In German, you say Führerdemokratie. And on this wonderful note, well, no, I actually have a couple of minutes, but it would be nice to finish on this note. So this is the picture of contemporary life that Weber draws. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think that Weber was very hopeful about how this free elections every 4 years can actually hope to subvert the system, because to some extent, again, this experience of the First World War showed him that rigid bureaucracy is bad, and you need to supplement rigid bureaucracy with something like market in the political sphere, so that people, with not with a static bureaucratic thinking, but with dynamic thinking, can emerge. Is this really going to be something else and not just efficiency for efficiency's sake? Already there, he's talking about how Germany lost the First World War because it was too bureaucratic. So you want to introduce a certain dynamic element, but why? For human freedom? No, for greater efficiency, obviously. I mean, Weber himself might not have, what's that phrase? Wishful thinking. Oh, elective affinity. I did not talk about elective affinity. Well, yeah, it's just sort of, just for fun, I guess I should. Yeah, so Weber's prediction for the future is, what awaits us in the future is not summer's bloom, but a polar night of icy darkness, of rationalization. Also, ethics of conviction, responsibility. Yeah, that's interesting, but not necessarily when I talk about this. Okay, so let me say one word at least, because it's a crime. It's against the Constitution to talk about Max Weber and not mention elective affinity. So Weber has this interesting phrase. Again, in German, it's Wahlverwandtschaft. So elective affinity. What does this mean? Elective affinity. Basically, this is Weber's attempt to get out of the sort of thinking in terms of historical laws. Elective affinity as opposed to a historical law. So when you look at this example of process of ethic and the spirit of capitalism, the idea is not, because again, you think about Marx, again, base superstructure. Is it the case that base simply produces the superstructure? Is it the case that somehow Calvinism was doomed to emerge, was fated to emerge since time immemorial? Like 13.7 billion years ago, in the book of history, was written that at this point in capitalist evolution, something like Calvinism would emerge. No, says Weber. No. And in fact, he thinks that capitalism could have begun in China much earlier if they had the right kind of cultural or ideological superstructure. But again, this notion of elective affinity, again, this comes from chemistry, or maybe from alchemy. When a medieval alchemist has a bunch of elements on the table, and some of them will, for seemingly no particular reason, will combine. So, I take these two, nothing happens. I take these two, nothing happens. I take these two, and first suddenly there's sparks and blue flame. Wow, this is elective affinity, Wahlverwandtschaft. Again, Goethe wrote a romantic novel where sort of, again, you take two people, they don't mix, but then a bunch, a certain couple, for seemingly no particular reason, suddenly come together. This is basically what Weber is talking about. That there is no deep historical reason or deep historical necessity why Calvinism should have served as basis for capitalism. It just so happens that Calvinism had certain religious elements which were developed for completely independent theological reasons, which mixed very well with the kinds of things that were necessary for the economic base. So this is basically what he's talking about. So if you want, this elective affinity in a certain sense is on the one hand, the attempt to introduce historical accident into historical analysis, right? Talking about accidents. But on the other hand, it's not really an accident. Because, again, if you think about this, okay, Weber seems to think that China was waiting for something like Calvinism to come about, India was waiting for something like Calvinism to come about, and then it just so happened that not in Europe, but in North America, Calvinism appeared. And this is how capitalism got going, which is, again, his analysis is centered on the United States. By the way, oh yeah, I also should immediately point out that contemporary sociologists don't buy this picture. This is overly simplistic. And immediately you have to supplement this picture with very important developments in Catholic Italy. So actually, again, if you take away from this class that capitalism is impossible without Protestantism, this is not what contemporary sociology thinks, and not what contemporary economic history thinks. We think that important developments were already there in place in Catholic Italy, and Weber is probably mistaking something. When he's talking about how in many countries of Europe you see leading merchants, Protestants, this is coming back to what we talked about a couple of classes ago. This notion that you have different societies with different values, and you have, and Weber actually talks about this. He talks about party, prestige, and property. So if you want, this is the merchant class, the Vaishyi. The prestige is the priestly class, the Brahmins, and a party is, if you want, the warrior class, the Kshatriya. Parallels to Plato also. The rational or something, the spirited and the appetitive part of the soul. And so this is property. So, and the idea being, and again, I mention this because this is something I don't understand fully, and this is something I want to keep thinking about. Because in the Middle Ages, yeah, or let's say in the early modern period, you had people like Jews or Methodists, Calvinists, Anabaptists, people who were excluded from the mainstream political life. And because they were excluded from mainstream political life, they sort of devoted all their energies to other spheres in which they were permitted to operate. For example, the economic sphere. And okay, so this connection between usury and Judaism, this connection between, Methodism or certain Protestant sects and economic success. But it's an interesting thing to think about, because I'm not sure, some of you who know history better than me. It seems to me that people at the time did not see this as somehow undermining the existing order. Yes, of course, you let the Jews and the heretics handle the money, because it's dirty. And who cares about money? I mean, I'm the king of France. Anytime I want, I can come and just confiscate all of your property. So today we tend to think of property as immediately and directly linking to power, but that was not always the case. And again, this issue that sort of a armed nobility can just take whatever they want, and sort of owning property is somehow a subordinate task, subordinate in prestige, and also subordinate in power. So maybe again, what's the right phrase? Weber is mistaking cause for consequence. It's not that Calvinism was suited to economic activity. It's just that because they were denied mainstream political participation, they had to look for other venues. Okay. Anyway, but this is side note. This is side note for me to think about. Okay. Anyway, I'm sure we're out of time. So let's see.